It says gufa there. There's two lines. So this is Daf Lamed Vav, and we are starting on Lamed Hey Amud Bet at the bottom of the page, 5 or 6 lines up from the bottom, in the middle of the line, where it says Gufa Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel V'chen Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Amar Rabbi Yochanan Shemen Zayit Mevarachin Alav Borei Pri Ha'etz. We said yesterday that Shemen Zayit, olive oil, the beracha is Borei Pri Ha'etz. It is the fruit of the tree. So, what case are we talking about here when we say that the blessing on shemen zayit is on olive oil is borei pri ha'etz? If you're telling me that he drank olive oil, but that can't be the case, because drinking olive oil is considered bad for you. It's considered damaging. It's not considered hana'ah. It's not considered enjoyment, because it's considered something unhealthy for the body. Yeah. So therefore, it's not considered a normal eating, a normal activity of eating.
I drink it every morning.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so I guess maybe situations have changed, but in those days, it was considered not even to be regarded as eating, to drink straight olive oil, drinking straight olive oil. So they considered that to be unhealthy. If a person misappropriates terumah, they take terumah that's supposed to go to the kohen, and they consume it, or they use it in some way. So there are two things that they have to pay. One is called keren. They have to pay the value that they consumed or damaged of the terumah. And the other thing is they have to pay chomesh if the person benefited, if they enjoyed the destroying of the terumah. In other words, they ate it. Let's say they ate some bread that was terumah. So not only do they have to compensate for the loss of the value of the terumah with the keren, they also have to pay chomesh, which means they have to add a fifth of the value on and pay that as well. And that's only done if there's hana'ah, if there's benefit. And we see in a Baraita that it says, why doesn't he pay the chomesh in that case if he drinks the oil, olive oil of terumah? Because it's not considered to be hana'ah, it's not considered to be benefit, because it's considered damaging. However, if you anoint yourself with the oil of terumah, because that was considered a healthy, normal use, to rub it on your skin as an ointment. So if you do that, then you have to pay not only what you consumed, not only the cost of the terumah that you damaged or misappropriated, but you also have to pay the chomesh because you enjoyed the process. But what does that show you? That shows you that drinking shemen zayit drinking olive oil is not considered a normal act of eating. It's not considered hana'ah. It's not considered benefit, and therefore one should not have to say a beracha at all. So then maybe you'll say that, what case are we talking about? We're talking about a case where you smeared the olive oil on bread, which is like they used to use it like butter. Just like we use butter, they used olive oil. So but that wouldn't work either. That also wouldn't necessitate a blessing of borei pri ha'etz, because when you eat bread, do you say a seber bracha on butter? You don't say shahakol on the butter. You say hamotzi. That's it. It covers it.
You said hana'ah is deriving pleasure, not that there's a benefit.
Right.
It's different.
But if it's considered objectively as something harmful, so I guess it's that even if you like the taste, it would be considered damaging.
Contrasting hana'ah with deriving a benefit. In other words, deriving a benefit is
right.
You can have no pleasure but derive a benefit.
Right, it means both. It has both meanings. So what Rashi, right. So what Rashi says, to explain that, what Rashi basically says is that it's not considered an act of eating. So even though you might enjoy it, it's not considered a benefit in the sense that it's not considered eating, because it's something that's normally not eaten because it's harmful for you. That's the way the Gemara is looking at it. So it would be like if a person were to drink, rubbing alcohol, like Kitty Dukakis or something used to do. So if a person drinks that, so even though they might enjoy it, it's not considered a normal act of eating because nobody drinks that, and it would be looked at as harmful, objectively speaking. So that's how the Gemara is looking at it now. But now when it comes to bread, Utznan, we learn so generally speaking, if you have something that's the main item and a condiment that goes on the item, so you say the beracha on the main item. You don't say a beracha on the condiment, or the thing which is considered tafel is considered secondary. So in this case, if you smear some olive oil on your bread, you're going to say hamotzi. You're not going to say borei pri ha'etz. So we're looking for a case where you're actually going to say a beracha on olive oil. So the Gemara goes on searching for this and says, rather it must be that you're drinking it in anigron. As we're going to see, what is anigron? Da'amar Rabba bar Shmuel anigron mayad desilka. That anigron is beet water. In other words, you would boil these. You would mix oil into it, but basically you would soak or boil beets in the water, and then you would drink the water. It's like V8 or something. I don't know. It would be something like that. So you would mix oil into that.
That's. I do that on a regular basis in my salad dressing.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Salad dressing, beet salad dressing with the water with olive oil.
Oh, okay. So there you go. So ansigron is maya de kulo shalke. So we have two things. We have anigron and ansigron. Ansigron is something that has all different kinds of vegetables soaked and boiled in it. So it's kind of like vegetable stock or something like that. Yeah, and the other one is beets. So the point is that they would mix in olive oil, and you might drink that. So imken havele anigron ikar v'shemen tafel. But still, you're going to have the problem that what's the main thing? The main thing is the vegetable water, not the oil. Ve'utnan ze klal kol shu ikar v'imot tefila mevarech ala ikar v'upoter tatfila. You're still going to have the problem that the oil is going to be a condiment or an additional ingredient. The main food is still going to be the vegetable water. So how are you going to justify saying Borei Priya Etz? Rather, what must we be talking about here? We must be talking about a person who's having a sore throat. So it says that a person who is choshesh begrono, who has a sore throat, so lo yar'enu b'shemen means he shouldn't gargle with oil. Techila b'Shabbat, in the first case on Shabbat, because it's a type of medical treatment, and you're not supposed to take medicine in the normal way on Shabbat, so you shouldn't gargle with the oil. But what you could do is instead put a lot of oil into the anigron and drink that. So you're drinking the oil actually, but you're drinking it through this anigron, and so it's not obvious that you're doing it for medicinal purposes. It looks like you're doing it to drink it, but you've spiked the anigron with extra oil to soothe your throat, let's say. It's like the way that people use honey today to soothe their throat, let's say. Pshita, that's obvious. So now that we have this case of what's the chidush here? What is the novel point here in this Baraita? So what might you have thought? In other words, you're telling me that the whole reason why Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel that you're supposed to say Borei Priya Etz on oil, on olive oil, was just for a case, basically, where you're drinking it in the anigron. So why do they have to tell you that? Because because you might have thought that since you're drinking it for medicinal purposes, you wouldn't have to say a bracha at all. So kamashmalan, that's why they have to come along and say since the person is getting a benefit from it, and he's enjoying it, he has both senses of hana'ah. It's both a physical benefit, and he also enjoys it because it tastes good. So therefore, he's going to say Borei Priya Etz, because in this case, actually the shemen is the main thing. It's the main thing because you put a lot of shemen into the anigron. You put a lot of it into the beets because and it's also the main thing in the sense that that's what you wanted. Because your real goal was to have the oil soothe your throat, but you couldn't gargle with it in the normal way, so you had to instead spike anigron with a lot of oil. But really, in that case, the main thing you're drinking is the oil, and that's why you would say Borei Priya Etz in that situation. What happens if a person decides to eat flour? Not flowers out of the garden. We're talking about flour like flour that you cook with. Okay, kemach. So Rav Yehuda says Borei Priya Adama. Well, what's the difference? You took the flour, you take the wheat. If you were to eat wheat kernels or something like that, so the wheat kernels you would say Borei Priya Adama. Let's say you toast wheat kernels or something like that. So in this case, all it is you ground up the wheat kernels into flour, and you want to eat the flour, so it should be Borei Priya Adama. Rav Nachman said Shakol Niya Bidvaro, that Shakol Niya Bidvaro is the correct beracha. Why? Because it's not the normal way to eat flour. People don't eat flour. People might eat roasted wheat kernels, but they won't eat flour. Flour is something that's that's in the process of becoming bread, but it's not meant to be eaten at that stage. Amar le Rava Rav Nachman. Rava said to Rav Nachman, Lo tiflo galei Rav Yehuda. You shouldn't argue with Rav Yehuda. who says that you're supposed to say Borei Pri Ha'adama on flour. Why? The Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel Kaimei Kavate, because Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel both agreed with him. Damar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, Vechen Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Amar Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yehuda said that Shmuel said, and similarly Rabbi Yitzchak said that Rabbi Yochanan said Shem and Zayin Mevarchin Ala Borei Pri Ha'etz, because they said that on olive oil you're supposed to say Borei Pri Ha'etz. Alma Afagav Dishtanei B'Miltei Ka'eh, that even though it changed, B'Miltei Ka'eh, it stays the same. And so too here, if you had the wheat kernel by itself, you would say Borei Pri Ha'adama. It's the fruit of the ground. So just because you ground it up doesn't mean it changes, it stays the same. B'Miltei Ka'eh. So the Gemara answers, wait a second, Midame, you can't compare flour to olive oil. Why not? Because Hatam Ledle Iluya Acharina. Because when it comes to olive oil, that's the end of the road. Olive oil is the highest product you make out of an oil, out of an olive. Once you've extracted the oil, that's it. But here, it's on its way to become bread. In other words, what do you do with flour? Nobody says, oh, there's some flour, I'm going to eat that for snack. Nobody says that. They say, I'm going to use the flour, I'm going to make it into something. Yeah, you can. Right.
But the fried flour is a snack.
Oh, really? Okay, yeah, so I guess...
What would you do if you have a piece of fish, a very tiny piece of fish, and you have lots of more flour around it, and you deep fry it? So which bracha?
Right, so that's going to be mizonot already. That's going to be mizonot because you cooked it. But
there's nothing. It's only flour and water.
Oh, that's tough.
Flour and water is right. Oh, because it's Well, in mizonot, when it comes to mizonot, it's a little bit different. Because with mizonot, even if it's the tafel, you're still going to say mizonot. So if you have like fish that's breaded fish, like that...
No, not breaded fish.
Oh, it's just flour.
No, flour, a huge quantity of flour, and a tiny piece of fish inside that quantity of flour that is deep fried. So it's not breaded, it's technically have more flour than fish.
That's a very good question. That's a very good question because, some of these things, they're conventionally based. So like in the Gemara, let's say it wasn't normal to eat flour by itself, but now maybe now things have changed. You might say, well, now you would say Borei Pri Ha'adama because now it's the normal way to use it. So it's a good question. See, we didn't expect to have a chef, in Ketzad Mevarchin with all the different foods. We're going to have a lot of interesting discussion. It's a good question. It's the same thing that they ask certain, they say that, fish used to not ever be eaten raw. Now, fish is eaten raw, it's sushi. Right. So our certain halachot might change. That, for example, normally the halacha is that if you're going to have a food that's normally eaten cooked and not raw, then a Jew has to cook it. That's Bishul Yisrael, right? Yeah. So what happens about now? So it used to be that fish had to be cooked by a Jew. What about today when now fish is normally eaten raw, just like vegetables? Right, so it's a question. Right, so it's an interesting question. So anyway, so now what they said was like this. So therefore flour is going to be different than oil, because oil is the end of the road. Flour, at least in their framework, was on the way to become bread. So therefore, it's considered like, okay, it's no longer wheat kernels anymore, which was commonly eaten, but it's not yet bread. So it's like lower than either one. It's not on the level of either one. So and since it has an ultimate destiny that it's going to become, and right now it's actually neither here nor there. It's neither wheat kernel nor is it bread. So therefore you say shehakol. That's what Rav Nachman said, and in fact that's what it says in the Shulchan Aruch. But it's a very interesting question that you're raising, David, about nowadays whether there would be any difference.
Wait, so Shulchan Aruch says that on flour you say shehakol?
On flour. But plain. If you eat plain flour out of the bag.
But isn't flour something that...
If it's cooked in something.
No bracha,
if it's cooked.
It's not something that you generally eat because it's not something you eat for enjoyment. That even if one person actually has it for enjoyment...
I mean, where's the line drawn, like what we said about oil before?
No, but
it's a good question.
Because isn't that something that established that flour in general
is not eaten?
Not something that's eaten, and that's what we go by. We don't go by just
apparently,
who like it, unless you are.
I think that the only time they say that is when it's considered something harmful that's not edible. Like for example. Like we said before, like rubbing alcohol, or if a person were to drink straight olive oil in those days, that was considered harmful. Right. But something that's not normally eaten even though it could, but it's considered edible, you would say shehakol. It seems like that's what the Gemara is saying. But it's a good question. Where the lines are drawn on this, it's very murky. It's a very complex subject. But Rabbi Zera said that Rabbi Matana said, Amar Shmuel, that Shmuel said, Akra chaya v'kimcha desa'areh mivarachinani alayu shehakol niyeh b'dvaro. So they said that on a gourd, a raw gourd, uncooked, or if you were to eat barley flour, okay? Barley flour, then you say shehakol niyeh b'dvaro. My lav dechitei borei pri adama. Doesn't that suggest, by specifying barley flour, doesn't he mean that wheat flour would be ha'adama? Because he's saying that barley flour specifically is shehakol. Implication being, wheat flour would be ha'adama. Lo, dechitei nami shehakol niyeh b'dvaro. No, he doesn't mean that. Really, even wheat flour would be shehakol. V'lashma'inan dechitei v'kol sheken desa'areh. But if that's the case, if wheat flour even is shehakol, why don't you just mention wheat flour? And certainly barley flour is going to be shehakol. It's obvious. It's not going to be better. So this is like what you're saying. In other words, you might think that if I were to tell you, if they'd used as the example wheat flour, you would say, oh, I know why wheat flour is shehakol, because at least it's considered edible, but barley flour not. Kamashmalan. So therefore we see that even barley flour, which is on the borderline of being edible, as we're going to see, it was considered harmful though. Is you still say shehakol? So omi garami melech v'zamit, but is it really different than like salt or salt water? That ditnan ala melech v'ala zamit omer shehakol niyeh b'dvaro. That if you eat salt, you have to say shehakol, even though normally people don't eat salt separately. If you eat like a brine, like salt water, you still have to say shehakol, even though people don't normally eat it. So why is that any different than barley? Why would you think barley wouldn't say a beracha? It's tarich salkadat achatim amina melach v'zamit avid enesh deshadei lepumeh, because sometimes a person will put a little salt in their mouth. If you've ever seen a kid, they love it. They love salt. They eat salt. Yeah, right. Aval kimcha desa'areh, but barley flour ho'il v'kasher lekukiyane, since it was considered bad for stomach worms, it would give you like all kinds of a serious condition in your stomach. Lo livrich aleklal, you might think that you don't say a beracha at all. Kamashmalan kevan de'ilei hana'amine ba'ei. You find out that since actually it's considered to be something that you get enjoyment from, you do say shehakol, even though it's not the normal way to eat it. So basically we have different categories here. We have a category of something that's definitely harmful and that people would not normally drink at all or eat at all. You have something that's apparently on the borderline, where it has some health risks, so that you might think that it's not really considered a food, but people do enjoy eating it sometimes. So you have multiple categories. I was thinking, like, for example, the seeds that the Israelis love to eat. The garinim that everyone eats. Yeah. So like, if you eat it with the shell, like say you eat the shells. Some people eat the shells.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
It's very salty.
Right. People like it. It's salty, it's good. It's bad for your stomach though. Right? So that's an example. That's an example of exactly what they're saying here about kimcha desa'areh. That it's something that people eat and they enjoy it because it has a salty taste, but it's really bad for your stomach, and they tell you not to eat it.
Also, the candy is bad for your teeth.
That's bad for you in the long run. We're talking about something that it's actually going to make you have a stomachache right away.
Now, what is Rashi Talmud for KM Kofman Mem Lamed?
Where do you see that? Kuf Mem Lamed in the Gemara?
Right.
Ka mashmalan, which means it teaches us. Lashmiya lanu something. Ka means nothing in Aramaic. It's like a connecting word. Okay. Mashma comes from lashmiya. Okay, right. Lan is lanu. Yeah. So it comes to tell you that you do say a bracha. So Korah, we talk about, it's very interesting, hearts of palm. So nowadays, hearts of palm, you find it in the store all the time. Right, so what's the beracha on hearts of palm? Rav Yehuda Amar Borei Pri Adama. So Rav Yehuda says it should be Borei Pri Adama. The problem is it's not really a fruit. It's really part of the part of the tree. Yeah. So Shmuel Amar Shakol Niyeh B'dvaro. Therefore, but Shmuel says it's Shakol. Why? Because Rav Yehuda Amar Borei Pri Adama Perahu. Because Rav Yehuda says I look at it as a fruit because it grows soft and they take it. But if you leave it, it hardens. It's part of the tree. Shmuel Amar Shakol Niyeh B'dvaro. Hoil B'sofol Hakshot. Shmuel says because eventually it's going to become hard and be part of the tree. It's not really a fruit. A fruit is not something that becomes part of the tree, becomes hard. Okay. So Amar Le Shmuel Rav Yehuda. Shmuel said to Rav Yehuda, Shinana. You're a sharp guy. Kivatach mistavra. You know what? It makes sense the way you're saying. Even though he disagrees with him, he's saying it makes sense. Why? Because the hatzinon sofo lakshot m'varchinan alei a borei pri adama. Because think about it, a radish. If you leave it in the ground long enough, it's going to become hard as a rock. And yet we say borei pri adama on a radish. But the Gemara says no. Veloi, but that's not really a good analogy because because when you put radish in the ground, you want the radish. That's what you're supposed to eat. But dikla lo natei eneshei adata dekura. But when it comes to the palm tree, you're not planting it in order to eat the heart of palm. Okay, that's not the goal in planting it. So therefore, you might argue that it's not considered a fruit at all. Is it really true that we go by a person's intent in planting the tree to determine what's considered the fruit of the tree? Like you're saying here, that heart of palm is not going to be considered a fruit of the tree because it's not what they intend to use when they plant it. So what about a caper bush? Because people would plant it for the flower. Okay, utnan, and it says in the Mishnah, al minei nitzpa, that on different types of caper, al ha'alin v'alatmarot, omer borei pri adama, on the leaves and on the little buds that grow on the leaves that are like not the part that you eat, but there are little other berries that grow on the leaves. You say borei pri adama, v'ala avionot, v'ala kafrisin, omer borei pri etz. But what's it called?
Caper berries.
Caper berries, but on the capers itself that you actually eat, those you say borei pri etz, and the kafrisin are the covers of those, the flower that covers it on the plant. If you were to take that off together with the capers, then you would say borei pri etz. But the capers.
The caper berries.
Oh, the caper berries that grow on the leaves? Yeah, there are two different things. One grows on the leaves, and they are called caper berries. Okay. The caper is the actual one that you like that usually you have with like chicken or something like that, right? Yeah. Oh, you eat them.
The caper berry is not well known in America, but it's a great.
Really? See, I'm so glad that we have a chef here. We learn about that. I don't know as much about this stuff. Okay. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Nachman bar Yitzchak says, okay, so what's the point? So they're showing that even though they would plant it, let's say, for the even though they would plant it not for all of these different things to be used, basically. They would plant it, they didn't have in mind to use all the different parts of the caper bush when they planted it. And yet you're saying Borei Pri Adama, you're saying Borei Pri Etz on the different parts. Okay, so how can you then say that, the reason why we say Shehakol on the heart of palm is because we don't plant the palm tree with an intent to eat that part of the palm. So the answer that they say is, okay, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Tzilaf Natei Eneshei Adatid Deshuta, Digla Lo Natei Eneshei Adatad Dekora. That when it comes to the caper bush, you do have an intent to eat all of the different parts. So even though they're not necessarily the main thing you had in mind, you had in mind for all of it. You had in mind for all of it when you planted it. Okay? Even though you might think that only the main thing that you planted it for might have been the flower. Okay? But everybody knows when you plant it that there are other things you can harvest from it. So it's all included. Whereas when you plant the tree, by definition the palm tree is not planted to take the heart of palm because you're diminishing the tree. So really what Rashi says it means is that with the caper bush, true, you might not have thought when you planted the caper bush, I'm going to take the leaves and I'm going to take the caper berries, I'm going to take the capers. You might not have thought that. But because you're not diminishing it by taking those pieces, they're going to grow back. So therefore it's included in your general da'at when you planted the caper bush. Whereas when it comes to the palm tree, you're actually diminishing the tree by taking the heart of palm out because that's the part that's growing. Okay, so therefore, it's by definition considered like you didn't intend to take that away because you can't say you planted something that the purpose of planting it was to diminish it. In other words, you can't call the diminishing of it the taking of the fruit of the thing. The taking of the fruit of the thing has to be something distinct from the thing itself. So therefore, the Gemara says that that's the distinction here. That's why the heart of palm is going to be Shehakol. And ve'afal gav dekal Shmuel Rav Yehuda, even though Shmuel gave a Chazaku Baruch to Rav Yehuda on his beautiful idea that it should be that it should not be Shehakol, then nonetheless the halacha follows. We follow Shmuel in saying that on heart of palm you would say Shehakol.
That's also why trees that were planted like orange trees,
right?
That were planted specifically to make orange juice. They were never intended for the
oranges, right?
you still say she'akol on the orange juice. You don't say.
Well, that's actually a machloket. There are actually some people who want to say that when it comes to the orange juice, yeah, I know, but there's some people who argue on that. There's some people argue on that. Yeah. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Yehuda said that Rav said tzlav shel orla b'chutz la'aretz zoreket ha'avionot ve'ochelet ha'kafrisin. He said if you have tzlav shel orla, if you have a caper bush that's orla, meaning it's in the first 3 years that it's been growing outside of Israel, throw away the capers, but you can eat the kafrisin. The kafrisin are these the flowers sort of that covers the capers as they grow. You can eat that part. But you cannot eat the capers themselves because they're orla. That's the problem. Okay, so the Gemara says, "Lememrad avionot pere v'kafrisin lav pere." So that's to say that only the capers are considered fruit, but actually the piece that covers the capers that is not considered fruit because you're allowed to eat it. Or but we'll raise an objection. But we just said that you say brei priya etz if you eat that part. That's sort of like shell type of thing that's the flour that's over the capers. So how could you say that it's not a fruit? So Huda Mark Rabbi Akiva, he's saying like Rabbi Akiva, meaning that when we said that you're allowed to eat the kafresin that are orla, even though it's in the first 3 years of the plant growing, he was following Rabbi Akiva. Titnan, as it says in the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer Omer tzlaf mitaser tmarot v'avionot, that when you take maaser from tzlaf, when you take maaser from the caper bush, you take maaser from the caper berries and from the capers and from that shell, okay, the flower shell. Rabbi Akiva Omer en mitaser el avionot bilvad mepnei shu peri. And Rabbi Akiva is the one who says no. The only thing you take maaser from is the main fruit, which is the capers. Even though there are other parts that are edible that are eaten, even the berries that grow on the leaves are eaten. Okay, still you only take from the main fruit according to Rabbi Akiva. And since according to Rabbi Akiva, that's the main fruit. That means that if it's orla, if you're dealing with a caper bush in the first 3 years of its life, you would be able to throw away just the main fruit and eat everything else, even though the other things are considered fruit in other respects as well. It doesn't matter. And that's what was being said before when Rav Yehuda said that you can throw away the main fruit and eat even the shell or the flower shell of the fruit. That's the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, that only the capers are considered fruits. Everything else on the bush is fair game. So v'neima halachak Rabbi Akiva. Why doesn't he just come out and say the law follows Rabbi Akiva? Why does he mention that you throw away the capers and you keep everything else? So iyamar halachak Rabbi Akiva hava amina filo ba'aretz. Because if we were to tell you the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva, you would think even in Eretz Yisrael. But in Eretz Yisrael, the halachot of orla are more strict. So kamash malan kol mekil ba'aretz halacha kimoto b'chutz ha'aretz. Because we have a general principle. Aval ba'aretz lo. We have a general principle that the most lenient view of orla is the one we follow outside of Israel. Whoever the most lenient position is. But in Israel, that's not necessarily the case. It's more stringent. So therefore, we're not going to follow Rabbi Akiva. We're not going to eat the caper berries or the kafresin, the sort of flimsy shell of the capers from the caper bush that's orla in Israel, even though we're allowed to do it here. We still have the question: why does Rav Yehuda, in the name of Rav, have to tell us to eat to throw away the capers and eat the kafresin? If we know, why does he just say the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva outside of Israel? It would be the same thing. It would be the same thing as saying only the capers are considered the fruits. Because if you were to say that, we would think that only applies to Maaser Ilan, to taking Maaser from fruits. Why? Because really, mideoraita, from the Torah, the only Maaser is Dagan, Tirosh, V'yitzar, is grain, wine, and oil. Everything else, like if you take Maaser from apples, pears, peaches, it's all rabbinical, even in Israel. So therefore you might say, that's why the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva, that we go by the main fruit, because we're dealing with trees, and when it comes to trees, it's rabbinical even in the land of Israel, so we don't have to be careful. But when it comes to orla, so in other words, when it comes to maaser, where fruits of other trees, including caper, are only going to be rabbinical anyway, there we might follow Rabbi Akiva and be lenient. But maybe when it comes to orla in Israel, it's definitely a deoraita. Here, we also actually hold that it's a deoraita, but we're less strict, okay? So here you might say, with orla, we're going to be strict, and we're going to say that we're going to follow the stringent opinion. And you can't eat the kafresin that are orla in the first 3 years. You can't eat the caper berries in the first 3 years. So therefore, you might think that you have to be stringent even in chutz haaretz kamash malan. Therefore, he has to come and tell you, not only with regard to ma'aser are we going to follow Rabbi Akiva's view, and say that only the capers are subject to the rule of maaser and are treated as the fruit of the caper bush. But even with respect to orla, which in the land of Israel is deoraita, so you might have thought that we need to be more stringent in chutz haaretz. No. Even there, we're only going to be strict about the capers. We're not going to be strict about any other part of the caper bush. So Ravina Ashkachela Mar Bar Rav Ashe. Once upon a time, Ravina found Mar Bar Rav Ashe the Kazarik Avionot v'Kachil Kafrisin, that he was throwing away the capers and he was eating those shells, the soft shells. So Amarle, he said to him, "My datach Rabbi Akiva de Mekel. You must be following Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was the one that said that only the Avionot, only those capers themselves are considered to be the fruit, and therefore you can be lenient outside of Israel because they lived in Babylonia, and you can eat them even when they're orla, even in the first 3 years."
Ravina was way after Rabbi Akiva.
Right, way after. If you're going to go by the most lenient opinion, go by Bet Shammai. Bet Shammai is even more lenient. The Tanan, as it says in the Mishnah, tzlav Bet Shammai omrim kilayim bakerem, that when it comes to tzlav, the caper bush itself, so according to Bet Shammai, it's kilayim bakerem, which means it's not a tree at all. Because kilayim bakerem means it's mixed, it's diverse seeds, meaning you can't plant it in a vineyard. What can't you plant in a vineyard? You can't plant vegetables and seeds in a vineyard. You're allowed to plant trees in a vineyard. Okay, so according to Bet Shammai, it's considered not to be a tree. It's kilayim bakerem according to Bet Shammai. Okay, Beit Hillel omrim en kilayim bakerem, but according to Beit Hillel, no, it's not considered kilayim bakerem. It is considered a tree. Okay, in other words, when you are kilayim bakerem, that means that if it's kilayim bakerem, that means it's a bush, not a tree. Okay, if it's not kilayim bakerem, that means it's a tree, not a bush. So there's a machloka. What is the caper bush? So, but everybody agrees that orla applies to it. The first 3 years you can't eat of the fruit. So wait a second.
Whether it's a tree or a bush?
Right. So there's a machloket whether it's a tree or a bush. With Beit Shammai saying it's not a tree, and Beit Hillel saying it is a tree. But they agree that you have to observe orla. So the question is, so first you're telling me, according to Beit Shammai, that it's a bush, it's a vegetable, because you're not allowed to plant it in a vineyard. So it's not a tree. But then you're telling me that everybody agrees you can't eat of its fruit for the first 3 years. That's not. That only applies to trees. That's va'araltem or latoet piryo. That's only talking about a tree. Right, that's what the Torah itself says. Untatem kol etz ma'achal. That's what it is. So alma. Therefore, you see min ilanu. So therefore, it's a tree. So ha lokashya. Beit Shammai sapoke misapkalahu. So Beit Shammai is not sure. They don't know. Va'avdei achalu chumra v'achalu chumra. Okay, so therefore they're stringent on both ends. If it's a tree, just in case it's a tree, we have to keep the rules of orla. And if it's a bush, we can't plant it in a vineyard, because a vineyard you can't plant diverse seeds. So they have to be strict on both sides. They're strict as if it's a tree and saying that you can't eat the fruit for the first 3 years. They're strict as if it's a bush and saying you can't plant it in a vineyard. But what's the point here? Mikol makom the Beit Shammai havale safek orla. But according to Beit Shammai, it's safek orla. According to Beit Shammai, which means when you prohibit the eating of the capers for those first 3 years, it's misafek. It's not definite. According to Beit Hillel, it's a definite, because according to Beit Hillel, it's a tree. But according to Beit Shammai, it's a safek. So, and we have a principle, utnan safek orla be'eretz Yisrael asur u'b'Surya mutar, and we have a rule that in Eretz Yisrael, a safek orla, a doubt about orla, is prohibited. In Surya, a doubt about orla is allowed.
Wait, is
okay?
the nature of the tree? Or
here it's the nature of the tree. Here it's the nature of the tree, but it would apply to both. In other words, if you go to Giant and there's an apple, You don't know when that apple. Maybe they planted that. Maybe this was the first year of that tree, and that's an orla apple. How do you know? The point is you don't know. Okay. Now, if you go to the orchard and Farmer Joe tells you, "I want to tell you about this tree. I just planted it 2 years ago, and would you like an apple from it?" That's not a safek. You know where it's coming from. Okay, but if you don't know, if it's either a safek because we don't know whether it's defined as a tree or not, or it's a safek because you don't know whether it's the first 3 years or not, there we are lenient. So in Surya, it's permitted, and it says uchutz ha'aretz, and in chutz ha'aretz, yored velokeach ubilvad shelo yir'enu loket. Basically, the rule is that you're allowed to go and take it. In other words, you can go apple picking. Right? As long as you don't know that it's definitely orla, you can go. So in a case like what we have today, we get it at the supermarket. It's impossible to know. There's no way you're going to find out whether that was orla or not. What are you going to go back to the
It's a new crop. So.
Which new crop, but you don't know how new the tree is, right? So who's going to know? You're going to go back to the probably the worker who was making 50 cents an hour picking it, and you're going to ask him how old the tree is. He's not going to know. Nobody's going to know. How are you going to trace your apple? So you're not going to know. But in chutz ha'aretz, what Rashi says is that you can go down and take from him. And even though it could be that he's going to bring, as long as you don't see him going to the new sapling and bringing you that apple, you can do it. As long as you see just a tree there and you take it, it's okay. You don't have to inquire further than that.
Is it the same reason?
Okay, even though you know, in other words, even though you know that there are both new trees and old trees in that orchard, and it's possible that he gave you one from one of the new trees. One of the saplings. It doesn't matter. You don't have to be choshet. You don't have to worry about it. Whereas in a situation where the vast majority, let's say, where you had a lot of new ones and only a few old ones, maybe you might say in Surya it might be more stringent. But in chutz ha'aretz, we're lenient.
So is that the same reasoning that we rely upon for the fruits that were merged? I don't know what it was.
The grafted fruits or whatever.
Fruit, yeah.
Well, grafted fruit is different because there's no really prohibition on eating the grafted fruit. There's only really a prohibition on making it.
So even the ones that are that in Israel were
well, that might be more complicated. Yeah, that might be more complicated. Yeah. So anyway, so Rabbi Akiva. So the point is that what's the point here? What he's saying is, why are you even bothering throwing away the capers? Because if we're following the rule that any safek about orla outside of Israel is automatically permitted, right? It's permitted. So if that's the case, so then. So we have another safek. You're saying you want to go with Rabbi Akiva's lenient opinion and say that only the capers are considered fruit, everything else isn't, so you can throw away the capers, eat everything else. But Bet Shammai holds that the whole thing is a safek, which means that according to Bet Shammai, outside of Israel, it's all permitted, even the capers themselves. Even if you know that they grew in the first 3 years, it's still a doubt because we don't know whether the caper is really a fruit of a tree or not. So therefore, you could permit the whole thing. Even in the first 3 years, you could permit the capers. Because if you want to go by the most lenient opinion of all, the most lenient opinion of all is Beit Shammai, because the most lenient opinion is saying there's a question whether it's a tree or at all. All right. So he says Rabbi Akiva b'mkom Rabbi Eliezer Abdinan Kivateh, or Beit Shammai b'mkom Beit Hillel ena Mishnah. The difference is, why am I throwing away the capers? Because I will be lenient and follow Rabbi Akiva's view outside of Israel, because we follow the most lenient view. And Rabbi Akiva versus Rabbi Eliezer, fine. But when it comes to Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, the view of Beit Shammai is eno Mishnah. It's ena Mishnah, which means it doesn't count at all. Right? I don't even consider it an opinion. Okay, although it's very interesting.
Lenient.
Right, it's very It turns out to be lenient, but really he's stringent. I mean, in the case, Beit Shammai is stringent, because in the case, Beit Shammai is saying we have to be strict and treat it both as a tree, l'chumra, and as a bush, l'chumra. Right. So it just happens to be that now you take that principle, which in its context is actually stringent, and now you come to chutz la'aretz. And it becomes a leniency. It becomes leniency. So it's a stringency turns into a leniency. So inadvertently, Beit Shammai is lenient. But the point is, their view is not counted in halacha. Now, it's very interesting that the Rambam actually ends up following a very similar shita in his analysis of tzlaf when he deals with the capers, that he treats them as a safek. And there's a long discussion about how he can do that, being that it seems like the Gemara here is saying that Beit Shammai's view is rejected. So there's a lot of discussion about that. Anyway, so now we go on. But let's try to derive that even according to, as Rashi says here, now we're going back to the discussion before, that even according to Rabbi Akiva, that says when it comes to ma'aser, we don't treat the kafresin as the main fruit of the caper bush. We don't treat those shells, the soft shell that covers the fruit, as a fruit itself. That's true with regard to ma'aser. But how do we know with regard to orla? With regard to the first 3 years of the plant's growth, that we don't treat it as a fruit. True that we don't treat it as the main fruit, so maybe for Maaser we don't need to worry. But why don't we treat it as that? Perhaps because it's the shomer. Because really it is the guard, it guards over the fruit, because it grows over the fruit and protects it. That you should treat as orla et pirio, its fruit, et hatafel pirio. The word et teaches you that even what is tafel pirio, even whatever is guarding and supporting the fruit in the plant, is considered as an extension of the fruit with regard to orlaf. So with regard to these first 3 years of eating from the fruit or not eating from the fruit of the tree, not only, let's say, would the fruit itself be a problem, but even let's say you took oranges and people take orange peel and they eat chocolate-covered orange peels or whatever. That's the shomer of the fruit. That's an extension of the fruit. So even though you might not have to take a separate maaser from orange peels, you would have to treat orange peels as orla as well. So therefore, umaynihu shomer lapri. So what is it talking about when it says tafel to the fruit, subordinate to the fruit? It's talking about the shomer, the guard of the fruit. So why don't we treat the kafresin, the soft shell, as like a guardian of the fruit, and therefore be prohibited? Why are we allowed to eat them and only throw away the fruit itself? Because what is a shomer of the fruit? What is guarding the fruit? Something that's attached to the fruit, whether it's on the plant or off the plant. But here, when you take the caper off the bush, it doesn't have that cover anymore. It's not something that comes with the fruit. It covers the fruit when the fruit is attached to the plant. But once you take the fruits off, it's not a shell that follows the fruit. It doesn't come off the bush. You take the capers off and there's no cover.
So it's not the orange where you take.
It's not like the orange. You pick an orange and it still has the peel on it.
Meaning that it falls off when you pick them?
Yeah, it's part of the plant. It's part of the plant. So when you take the capers off the bush, the part of the plant that was covering it is not there anymore. It's already fallen off.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
In other words, you separated them.
Yeah, it's already fallen off. I think it actually falls off even before, but it's not there when you pick it.
I see. Okay.
So when you take it, it doesn't come with it. So
that makes it permissible to eat it.
So he's saying that those kafresin are not really considered part of the fruit because they're already gone when you pick the fruit.
Because
they're not attached to the fruit.
The berry is on its own merits the fruit itself.
Right. The caper is the fruit. That's considered the fruit. But this would be a covering of the fruit. The only thing is that when you actually pick the fruit, it's not with it. So it might serve as a covering at some point, but it's not really considered a tafel. It's not like an attachment of the fruit that comes with the fruit when you pick it. So yeah. Yeah. So Abaye. So now Eteve Abaye raised the following objection: Pitma shel rimon. That the stem of the pomegranate, mitzarefet, is included as part of the pomegranate. And this is actually talking about tumat uchlin. This is talking about if we're measuring if there's enough in this pomegranate to become tameh, in a case where it would become tameh. Vanet shelo en mitzaref, but the flower on top, the bud on top, is not considered part of the fruit. So why? What you see from that is alma delav ochelo. So you see that it's not considered part of the food. Because if it were considered part of the food, that flour, then it would count towards the size of the pomegranate for purposes of tum'ah. Vitanya, gabe orla, and we learned regarding orla, klipe rimon, vehanet shelo, klipe egozim, vagarinim, chayavin be'orla. But yet you see that the shells of the pomegranate and its bud or its flower, and the shells of the nuts and their seeds, the seeds inside fruits are considered to be part of the fruit, and therefore they're considered to be orla. So you see that there's a different rule with regard to orla, that we consider even things that normally wouldn't be considered part of the food to be under the prohibition of orla. Even the flower of the pomegranate is considered. So why wouldn't the flower, so to speak, of the caper be considered? It doesn't matter that that's going to fall off at some point. It doesn't matter that it's not really guarding the fruit. You see that when it comes to that, sometimes we distinguish between things that are considered part of the fruit and things that are not considered part of the fruit. So we see that the flower of the pomegranate is not considered part of the fruit. With regard to tumah, it's not considered part of the fruit. And yet, it is considered a part of it with regard to orla. It's forbidden to eat it under the rule of orla, despite the fact that it's not really an effective shomer, because it's not really a shomer, because it's not something that's going to protect the fruit, the flower.
Maybe he has the allusion to think that you cannot eat, because the example he has here, if it's the rimon or the nuts, the cover of the nut, you cannot eat it, but you can eat the cover of the orange.
Right. Well, it's assuming that these are soft and edible. Right. They're edible on some level, but the point is that even though this thing on top of the like on the in the Rashi explains it. So he says that shomrim, things that guard the fruit, normally are considered as part of the fruit. So he talks about that like the shell of a nut or the shell of a pomegranate. But the nets, the flower, is shomer al gabe shomer. It's two removed, because it's doubly removed, because there's a shell around the pomegranate already, and then you have this flower.
No, but if you cannot eat that part of orla, so it doesn't make no difference.
Well, the question is right, but apparently it's edible. But why is it considered part of the fruit at all? It's not a shomer. You just said that it has to be a shomer. Right? So the Gemara said that it had to be a shomer, and it has to be something that even
if you can eat it, but if you cannot eat it...
Well, they're assuming in a case where it's edible. So,
yeah. You can eat the cover of the nut.
I guess when it's, I think maybe when it's very immature, it's soft. The klipa, the inside, the klipa. You can. Not the hard shell, that you can't eat. Yeah, that you can't eat. So he says, Ela amar Rava, Hecha amrinan denasa lehu shomer leperi, Hechad ite b'shat gemar pera. HaKafres lete b'shat gemar pera. So he changes this position. He says, okay, so it's not about whether it's there when you remove it or when it's attached to the plant, because we see that even though the flower, let's say, is not going to be really, it's not really a shomer. It's not going to be when you take the pomegranate, when you harvest it, you're not going to have the flower there anymore. And yet that flower is still considered to be a part of the fruit. Okay, it's still considered a part of the pomegranate for the purposes of orla, even though when you remove the pomegranate, you're not removing the flower with it. Okay, the flower is not going to be a part of the fruit. So therefore, we would say the same thing about the kafresin, that even though when you remove the capers, you're not going to have that covering of the kafresin anymore, they should also be orla, just like the flower of the pomegranate. But instead he says, okay, here's the distinction. Any covering that's still there when the fruit reaches its full maturity, okay, is considered to be part of the fruit. But kafresin fall away before the capers are fully ripe.
Assuming it's edible.
Yeah, it's edible. We're assuming always that it's edible. Yeah. So Eini v'amar Rav Nachman amar Rabba bar Avua, that Rav Nachman said, that Rabba bar Avua said, Hane matchaled orla asirei hoil v'nasu shomer leperi. But he said with regard to dates that there's apparently a soft shell also that grows over the dates and falls away when the dates are fully ripe. Okay, it's when they're immature, it's there, and then it falls away. And yet it is considered for orla purposes. If you were to eat that soft shell, it would be considered part of the fruit. V'shomer leperi emat haveh. But kufra. And when does that covering cover the dates? It covers them when they're in a state of kufra, which means when they're immature, not when they're mature. V'kakarele shomer leperi. And yet we treat them as a covering, a guard of the fruit. So what do you see? You see that even something which falls away before the fruit reaches maturity is still considered a protection of the fruit. It's still considered an extension of the fruit. So therefore again, kafresin, which protect the caper at a certain point, fall away before the fruit is fully mature, but that shouldn't matter. It should still be considered part of the fruit. Rav Nachman Nachman davar like Rabbi Yossi. That's only because Rav Nachman. We don't have to care about what Rav Nachman said. He's wrong because he follows Rabbi Yossi. The Tana, it says in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi Omer Simadar Asur Mipnei Shu Peri, because Rabbi Yossi said that even a Simadar, the very beginning of the grape, the very immature grape, is considered a fruit. And the rabbis argue with him. In other words, they say that we only look at something as a fruit when it's fully mature. Anything that guarded the fruit when it was immature doesn't count. And Rabbi Yossi says that no, even a Simadar, even an unripe grape is considered a grape already. That's what Rav Nachman was following. So when Rav Nachman said that dates, that covering of dates, the protection of the dates, even when they're immature, is considered a covering, that's because he was following Rabbi Yossi, because Rabbi Yossi said that even an immature fruit is considered a fruit. But we don't hold that way. So therefore, the kafresin that fall off the capers before they are mature would not be considered a protection of the fruit. Don't get comfortable too quickly, because Matkifla Rav Shimi min Harda'ah, Rav Shimi from the Harda'ah raised an objection. But wait a second. The rabbis actually agree with Rabbi Yossi. They only disagree about grapes. In almost every other case, they agree with him. It says in the Mishnah, there's a rule that you can't cut down fruits during Shemitah, cut down fruit trees once they start producing fruit, because it says le'ochla. During Shemitah, the fruit has to be for eating, for the eating of animals and for the eating of people who can come and pick it. So you can't cut down trees as soon as they start producing fruit. So from when? Beit Shammai omrim kol ilanot mishiyotziu. According to to Beit Shammai, any tree, as soon as fruit starts to appear, even if it's the slightest appearance, in other words, even if the fruit is not yet mature, it's not yet ripe, we still say that you can't cut it down. Beit Hillel omrim, Beit Hillel has a more complex view. Charuvin, so when it comes to charuvin, to carobs, mishi yish rishu. So that's from the time that you see chains of carobs on the tree. That's when you can't cut it down anymore. Okay, vagifanim mishi yigra'u. We're going to see what that means in a second. Vazetim mishi yanitzu. When it comes to olives, from the time that they bud, that you begin to see the buds of that are going to grow into the olives. Usharkola ilanot, and all other trees mishi yotziu, from the minute that they show any fruit growth. So that means even though unripe fruit is growing, it's still considered fruit. V'amar Rav Asi hu boser hu garua. So when it says mishi yigra'u, when it says gifanim, vines, from when they geru, that's referring to boser, that's referring to immature grapes. Hu pola lavan, which is the same as the pola lavan, which is a type of bean. Pola lavan sal katatach. What do you mean that the grape is a white bean? Ela ema shiro ki pola lavan. What they meant was that once the grape is the size of pola lavan, it's the size of this bean, this white bean, that's when the grape is considered significant. So they disagree with Rabbi Yossi that he says that even the tiniest size grape is already considered a grape. They say it has to be a little bit bigger than the tiniest size. It has to be the size of a bean. But that's the only place that they make that distinction. Everywhere else they say as soon as fruit appears, even in the earliest stage, it's considered a fruit. Okay, man shamat le damar boser in smadar lo rabanan vekatane shar kol ilanot mishiyotziu. And who were the ones who distinguished between different stages of growth in a grape? It wasn't Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi said as soon as it appears, it's considered a grape. So it's only the rabbis who distinguish, and yet they're saying all other fruit trees, as soon as they produce anything, it's considered fruit. So therefore, when you come back to our case of capers, we can't try to say that Rav Nachman was only going according to Rabbi Yossi. Even the rabbis would agree that dates, even the unripe dates, are considered to be a fruit. They would agree that even the unripe capers are considered a fruit. So therefore they should agree that the covering that is there when the fruit is unripe is also considered a part of the fruit, because it's serving as a shomer during that time. It's serving to guard the fruit. Ela amar Rava, rather Rava revises his opinion again. Hecha amrinan dave shomer laperi. Hecha di ki shaklat le la shomer mait pera. Hecha ki shaklat le lo mait pera. The answer is, and this is the final answer, that what he says is, what is a shomer for the fruit? What's considered guarding the fruit? Anything that if you take it away, the fruit will die. So when it comes to capers, if you were to take the kafresin away, even while they were on the plant, the capers wouldn't die. But anything that you would take away and the fruit would die, that's considered, because in other words, where the fruit's existence is dependent upon it, it's considered a shomer. Basically, that's what he's saying. So, hava uvda v'shaklo lanetz de rimona v'yavesh rimona. And here's the proof, because when they took that flower off of a pomegranate one time, the pomegranate dried out. In other words, it needed that extra covering on top to serve as a guard. Okay? But v'shaklu la pircha de bitita v'kayim bitita. But when they took away the covering of bitita, which is another word for the the capers. Okay, so when they took away the covering from the capers, they took away the kafresin. Right. So it didn't die. So what does that show you? In other words, they did an experimental verification of this, and they found that if you take away the covering of the pomegranate, that flour, which we said before is included in the prohibition of orla, the fruit dried out. It died. If you take away the kafresin, the special covering of the immature capers, they do not dry out, they do not die. And that's why, since the existence of the capers is not dependent upon them, they're not considered a part of the fruit, and they're not considered subject to the rules of orla. Now we see here in the parentheses, and generally speaking, when you have parentheses like this, it means that it's not part of the authentic text. It's erased by most of the editors of the Rishonim, the later editors or the later rabbis who had manuscripts of the Gemara would write that this was not included in the original manuscript. Somebody inserted this based on later works. So sometimes what we find in the Gemara is things from the Savoraim, who are the later generation of rabbis after the Gemara, that got included in the Gemara because somebody put notes on the side of their manuscript and it accidentally got printed in there or whatever it was. So here, this piece is not really included, but it says it says that the halacha follows Marbar Rav Ashi, that you have to throw away the capers, but you can eat those floury coverings. And according to this, that we're treating the kafresin, that we're treating those flowers that cover the capers as not a part of the fruit for orla purposes. We would also say borei priya adama, because it's considered part of the plant and not part of the fruit. So that actually, according to the Masorot Shas on the side, that comes from the Bal Halachot Gedolot ve'eno min Gemara. It's not really from the Gemara. And as the Rosh in his commentary quotes this section as coming from the Bal Halachot Gedolot, not from the Gemara. So you see that it doesn't really belong as part of the text of the Gemara. We'll just do a tiny bit more. Pilpulei. What if somebody eats pepper? Anybody ever eat pepper? Some kids try it sometimes. Rav Sheshet Amar Shakol. Rav Sheshet says Shakol because it's not normal to eat that. Rava Amar Lav Lo Klum. You don't eat it at all. You don't say any bracha at all. Okay, va'azdar Rava l'ta'amed. Amar Rava kas pilpulei b'yomei dekipurei patur. Kas dan gvila b'yomei dekipurei patur. That Rava said that if a person chews pepper on Yom Kippur, patur, he's not considered to be. And when it says, it doesn't mean you chewed it and spit it out. It means if you chew it, he says kol davar she'adam ochel shelo kedarko. It's considered something which is not edible in a normal as a separate food. So if a person eats that, it's not considered eating on Yom Kippur. And if he ate ginger, it's not considered eating on Yom Kippur either. Obviously, you're not allowed to do it, but he's saying patur. You're not considered to have violated the prohibition of eating on Yom Kippur. Okay, so Meitive, there is an objection to this. Why does it have to start out in the pasuk by saying etz ma'achal? That we're talking about a fruit tree. If right afterwards it says you should prohibit the first fruits of the tree. Obviously, why does it have to mention that it's a fruit tree and then say you have to prohibit the first fruits of the tree? It could just say, when you have a tree, prohibit its first fruits for the first 3 years. Why do you have to say it's a fruit tree? It's obvious from the context that it's a fruit tree. It's to bring why is it mentioned etz machal? To tell you about a tree where the fruit and the tree have the same taste. And what is that? Pilpilin. That is pepper. When you eat pepper, apparently if you eat pepper or you eat the plant from which the pepper comes, they have a similar taste. To show you that pepper is obligated in orla, and to also tell you that the land of Israel is not lacking anything. Because it says you won't eat bread poorly, in poverty, and you won't be lacking anything. So it shows you that pilpulin, that actually pepper is considered a fruit. So how can you say you don't say any bracha on that? Lo kashya. Ha b'retivta, ha b'yabishta. It depends. B'retivta, when it's wet, in other words, when it's fresh, it can still be eaten. But when it's dried, then it's not considered to be a normal way of eating it. Amre le Rabbanan Marimar. The rabbi said to Marimar, "Kasang v'ila b'yom ha'kippur patur." If you chew ginger on Yom Kippur, you are exempt. So they said that. Where was I? Ve'ha'amar Rava, but Rava said, "Hay hamalta da'atya mi be'handuai sharia umivarchin ale bre pri ha'adama." They said this certain type of, I guess, some kind of a ginger type thing that comes from. Rashi says Kushiim. It comes from India. It comes from some African. He says some African place that it's allowed, meaning there's no issue of bishul nochrim. That even if they cooked it, it's not a problem because it's something that could be eaten raw. Okay, and you say brei pri adama on it. So lo kashya again. Ha b'retivta, ha b'yabishta. Same point. That one is talking about when it's fresh and it's wet. One is talking about when it's dried out, and because it's dried out, it's considered to be inedible, and therefore. Or at least not edible by itself. In other words, you use it as a spice. You might use ginger or you'll use pepper dry as a spice, but you're not going to eat dried pepper. You're not going to eat dried ginger as a food. So therefore, it's not considered a normal way of eating. And even on Yom Kippur, a person would not be considered liable for violating Yom Kippur in such a case. And we'll continue here tomorrow. Chazak.